Dr. Matthew Lupu.
How you doing?
I'm great. How are you doing?
I'm having a party. I'm so happy to be here. I love talking about the ancient world. So thanks for the invite. And I'm excited.
Yeah, I'm really excited too. I wanted to bring you on to talk about this topic, not only because you're an expert in the time period of the Severans when Philostratus is writing his biography, but also you are my husband.
We're married.
We're married.
Yeah. It's wild.
Everyone's jealous. But you just finished your dissertation last year.
Yes.
On Cassius Dio.
Correct.
Who's Cassius Dio?
So Cassius Dio is an author. He's also a politician. He's a senator. He eventually rises to the rank of consul. He has quite a distinguished public career. He at the end of his career, he becomes a governor. He's really an eyewitness to a lot of Roman history. And as an eyewitness to a lot of Roman history, he writes the last ab urbe condita history of the Roman Empire. So his history exists it's fragmentary at parts, so not all of it exists equally well preserved. But the original work was 80 volumes, and it starts with the mythical foundations of Rome, goes back to the Romulus and Remus story, and then sort of ends with the end of his political life under the very tail end of the Severan dynasty.
Yeah. And so I know what your dissertation is about, but maybe you can give everybody kind of an overview of what angle you're looking at Cassius Dio through.
Absolutely. So Cassius Dio, for a long time, has sort of been didn't have the best reputation as a Roman historian, especially when you consider some of the more canonical classic Roman historians. So he sort of is understood in comparison with Livy and Sallust, and even the Greek historians like Thucydides. And Cassius Dio for quite a while, really only starting in the 1960s, starts to have his rehabilitation in the world of classics. He starts to come back, and scholars are become more interested in looking at him. I was interested in understanding Cassius Dio as a political thinker and a political philosopher, political strategist. And I'm especially interested in understanding his relationship with Plato and Platonic philosophy. Sort of in the earlier parts of the 20th century, and even before that, back in the bad old days when scholars were not quite so interested in reading Dio or didn't take him seriously as a philosopher or as a historian, the sort of consensus in the field was that Dio wasn't interested in philosophy, didn't care about philosophy, didn't have a coherent philosophy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And my argument is that's actually not true. That Dio had a very coherent philosophy, especially when it came to how the empire should work when it's firing on all cylinders. And that helps explain some of his literary choices, right? And explains why he's not really happy with the way that the empire is working during his lifetime. Really going back to the reign of Commodus is sort of when we start to get his eyewitness accounts, and he doesn't have anything good to say about Commodus or really many of the emperors that come after Commodus. Yeah.
Yeah, and things are changing in the empire too, right? We've been in the empire for some time, so the idea of having an emperor is, I guess, more common, or more people were used to the idea of having an emperor. So that's kind of not the issue. But What has changed really in the Severan period, would you say, from maybe even from the time of Apollonius? Because Apollonius is living between, say, Nero and Nerva,
Yeah.
or Nero and Trajan, maybe. So what is different from that period to now in the Severan period?
Yeah, that's a great question. Lots of things have changed between that time and the time of Dio. Culturally, what has changed is we're starting to see more of a shift eastward. So there's more literature being produced in the eastern part of the empire, more literature being produced in Greek. There's more of an interest in Greek literature of the classical era. So you have to figure like the 5th century and 4th century Athens, Athenian Greek, Attic Greek is becoming much more. I want to say it's what authors are aspiring to write. So there's a lot of authors that are writing in that sort of style of Plato or the style of Thucydides or the style of Demosthenes. You can pick whichever Attic authors that you like, right? The paradigmatic ones.
Yeah, and they're trained on these texts.
Yes. So Attic Greek as a means of like I don't know, like daily language. That's not a thing. By the time of Cassius Dio.
Spoken in the markets, spoken
Correct.
in the Senate, or?
No, not really spoken at all. So, I mean, it's not to say that people aren't speaking Greek. They are. It's just that Greek as a language has changed significantly between classical times, right? So, again, fourth century BCE, 5th century BCE, around that time. And we're talking about a time period much later than that. So we're talking about basically 700-ish years later. So, I mean, you can just imagine how much English has changed in the last 700 years. If you go and read a text, read Geoffrey Chaucer, you can understand it when you read it, but nobody would ever speak that way.
Right.
So now the equivalent would be that the way that we speak English is totally different, right? But let's say that there was a devoted literary class that was very, very interested in preserving the style of Geoffrey Chaucer. And
right. So works of great literature are produced in this kind of archaic form.
Yes.
So as these authors are being trained on these texts, they're also being trained on the content of these texts, right? So maybe a better way to ask it is this: what would someone like Cassius Dio or like Philostratus, as they're going through their own personal education as a young person, what would that look like for somebody like them?
Yes. So the way that would look, at least according to Lucian. So Lucian is roughly contemporary to the other two authors you mentioned, Dio and Philostratus. And Lucian talks about this. He's got all kinds of texts talking about how the philosophical texts of yesteryear are not just manuals to learn how to produce this kind of Attic style, but a real philosopher absorbs the lessons of the text in addition to the writing style and the command of the grammar and the command of the vocabulary and things like that. And that seems to be a prevalent kind of opinion that people have, especially from this area of Syria, where a lot of these writers are producing texts like this. So, Cassius Dio himself is not Syrian, but he's Greek from Anatolia, so not so far away from Syria. Lucian is Syrian, and Philostratus is Syrian, and we have other authors from around the same time period as well who are studying philosophy also in this area. I think a real famous example would be Porphyry, is a Syrian author who's sort of also part of this same kind of literary revival type movement, which we broadly refer to as the Second Sophistic movement. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a few different directions I want to take this, but maybe as we close out this kind of discussion of what the educational and philosophical scene looked like, maybe on a broad scale, I guess the last question I have on that before we turn towards Syria and talk about Julia Domna is, there is a distinction in this time period, and I'm not sure how far back it goes. It seems like it goes all the way back to Socrates, between the true philosopher and the kind of charlatan philosopher who maybe sounds good but doesn't actually say anything important. So can you maybe talk a little bit about this distinction and what a quote-unquote true philosopher might have been on the lookout for or guarding themselves against?
Sure. So this is the tension between the philosopher and the sophist, right? So the sophistes and the philosophos are different kind of. They're similar in the sense that, and again, I'm sort of going back and drawing from Lucian here to answer this question, but Lucian talks a lot about the difference between the one and the other, and the main difference is that the fake philosopher, the sophistes, is going to have the lingo and the jargon, and they're going to sound really good, and they're going to sound like they're speakers of this kind of Atticizing dialect of Greek, and they're going to give popular speeches. And when they give the popular speech, they're going to use these kind of archaic terms that sound very philosopher-ish and philosopher-y. But what separates them from being a true philosopher is that the quality of their arguments and the personal choices that they make are not philosopher-like. So a true philosopher is going to practice what he preaches in the Christian parlance, right? And the fake philosopher is going to put on a show. But when you scratch the surface even a little bit, the real philosopher will be able to tell, even if the public is fooled. And that actually presents a giant problem for the field of philosophy, or for intellectual culture in general, is that it's very easy for people to fake it. And it seems like it's a chronic problem, that there's lots and lots of people who are trying to make a living as a kind of pseudo intellectual or pseudo philosopher, and they're effective because the general population can't tell the difference, right? And only the really super elite educated people can, and when they do. Maybe they're not as good a speaker as the fake philosopher is, and they lose things like public debates, or they don't sort of receive the same kind of popular following that some of these philosophers would have received. Much in the way that according to Philostratus, Apollonius received, he sort of builds a following over time, and he's got lots and lots of people that are interested in him speaking publicly and listening to what he has to say about philosophy. And that seems like it's not an uncommon practice, especially in the eastern part of the empire, and especially at the time that Apollonius is alive and practicing his philosophy, even that far back.
Yeah, and there's a financial element as well. It's explicitly in Philostratus, and I should have gone back and looked, but I remember Socrates saying something about this. The sophists are the ones that will charge you a whole bunch of money to teach you a bunch of crap, whereas the true philosopher is not pursuing money, and if they get it, then great. But Apollonius in particular seems to value this almost like mendicant kind of lifestyle, where there is no pursuit of worldly things. And we can get into kind of how deep he goes into that. But this word sophist is something that's interesting to me, because you talk about the second sophistic movement, which is distinct from this philosopher-sophist dichotomy, right? What is the second sophistic?
Yeah, so great question again, right? The sophistic movement, and there's we could go super nerdy and super technical here. I'm going to try and spare you because there's argument about everything, right? When we start getting into the literature, the Cliff Notes version of what the second sophistic movement is that it's a kind of rebirth or interest or a new interest in the same texts that were very popular in the 2 or 3 generations or so after the death of the original kind of Platonic Academy, right? The heavy hitters of the Platonic Academy. So when you think about the first sophistic, you think about authors like Plato and Aristotle and so forth. And those authors are very, very influential in life. They spend a lot of time sort of publicizing their philosophy. They develop all kinds of different students who are very, very interested in keeping their schools alive and keeping the tradition going. And then there's a period of sort of decline after this happens, after the first sophistic sort of runs its course. And that's because of a lot of different reasons, but a lot of them are political, some of them are cultural. Alexander the Great doesn't really help. The political kind of changes to the ancient world that happen as a result of Alexander's conquests and the successor states that take over. All of this sort of results in a general a pause in philosophical development. And it seems to only really come back in force by the sort of the end of the Roman Republican era. And there's people that would argue about specifically when does the second sophistic start. There's different people put different sort of dates on it. Who gets included in the second sophistic movement? This is all kind of up for debate. Is it even right to think of there being a second sophistic movement? Is it just that interest in authors like Plato and Aristotle never really died out? I kind of subscribe to that idea that this is a little bit of an artificial boundary we're drawing here between a quote-unquote first sophistic and a second sophistic. I tend to think of the interest in philosophy as never really going away. Just looking at it like that there are times where it's more popular and more people are writing, and there are times when it's less popular and less people are writing about philosophy is probably a more holistic way to look at it. So the point though is that when scholars talk about the second sophistic, usually what they mean is literature written in Greek that comes from the eastern part of the Roman Empire, anywhere from about let's say 70 CE up until the beginning of what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century.
So post Severan.
Post Severan, yeah. The end of the Severan dynasty. We have a couple of works that still come from a little bit later. But there's a definite decline in the output of this type of literature. Certainly by the middle of the 3rd century, nobody has the luxury to sit down and write like this anymore, right? Not in the same type of volume that people were writing beforehand.
There's too much going on politically at that time.
That's a nightmare. That's a nightmare.
Yeah.
That time period is a bad time to be around. That's you're talking about a 50-year uninterrupted civil war. Nobody knows who the emperor is. Anybody can be the emperor. Everybody's got their hand up going, I'm the emperor, right? The emperor lasts for 2 weeks, sometimes and gets assassinated immediately. I mean, it's a disaster. Yeah.
Poor Gordian. So
Gordian's rough.
Maybe we can turn now to the Syrian angle here, because as you said, there's a lot of writing coming out of that area, or at least there's a lot of writers coming out of that area and coming to other parts of the empire. and getting involved in, we'll say, the imperial circles. But in particular, during the Severan period, we also get members of the imperial family coming out of Syria. So this brings us to Julia Domna, who, at least according to Philostratus, he says that Julia Domna asked me to write this book for her. So I'm really interested to hear more about Julia Domna. So she's the wife of Septimius Severus. She comes from Syria. She comes from, is it a royal family in Syria or just an aristocratic family in Syria?
Yeah, it's an aristocratic family for sure. There probably is a royal connection at some point. So there's a couple of different small quasi-independent states right on the edges of the Eastern Roman Empire that kind of exist as buffer states almost between Rome and Persia. And the
friendly
Persian
to
Empire.
Rome, but
Right, friendly to Rome, but quasi-independent. There's sort of all kinds of high political intrigue happening at Rome way before Julia Domna is born, trying to figure out where exactly does the Roman Empire end, and where does Persian territory begin. So Julia Domna is the daughter of the high priest of El Agabal or El Jabal, depending on which pronunciation you're going to use. And this high priest or this class of priests are, we think, just like lots of places in antiquity, that you sort of had to have been an elite or born into an elite family to even qualify, for this type of position, a position of political influence and public trust, very similar to the way that you would need to have been born into a relatively elite family to be considered for one of the public priesthoods at Rome, right? It's both
something like a Vestal Virgin or
exactly.
a Flamen or something.
Exactly right. Yeah. It's both a political and a religious kind of role.
Right.
So Julia Domna gets married to Septimius Severus while he's still a rising star. His political career is sort of simmering under the surface. He's not really a high-ranking Roman official just yet.
Yeah, and he comes up through the military.
He does. Well, he starts his life as a plain old civil servant. Okay. Where he starts his life working, overseeing things like road development, and maintenance. He's kind of in that. It's not an explicitly military role that he has yet, but he eventually does take on this military kind of responsibility as he gains more and more political offices. It opens up a path for him to rise even higher, via the military. And indeed, once he starts his military career, he was able to work his way up through the ranks and eventually becomes, a pretty powerful general who's commanding troops on the northern border with Germany. But that's going to be after he's already met and married Julia Domna. Yeah.
And then once he becomes the emperor, she becomes the empress, and she brings with her her entire cultural milieu, and especially her religious and philosophical milieu, coming from a priestly family, but from a different religious tradition. But she becomes interested in, what do you even call it? Greco-Roman philosophy, I guess. She becomes interested in the philosophy of the empire, and also with certain philosophical religious traditions. Right?
Yeah, definitely. I think a better way to look at the intersection between philosophy and religious practice, especially at this time period. So when we're talking about like late 2nd century CE, early 3rd century CE, there's a lot of refiguring the way that traditional religious practices worked. And not just to say Greco-Roman religious practices, but also other religious practices. There's a great diversity of religions that are practiced throughout the Roman Empire.
Yeah,
And
especially as more territory gets brought under the empire, right? So once Egypt becomes a part of the empire, you get all of these new cults to Isis popping up everywhere. So is that something similar with the Syrian religion then?
Yeah, I would say so. So, traditional Semitic religions, the successor religions to what the Canaanites were practicing, or what the traditional religion of the Phoenician towns, places like Byblos and Sidon. Those traditions continue even after they're incorporated into the Roman Empire. I would say that they're changed. They're certainly changed by their contact with Greek religious practices under Alexander, since Alexander the Great and the successor Macedonian kings sort of control this territory of Syria for quite a while before they get incorporated into the Roman Empire. So it's sort of wrong to think of traditional Syrian religious practices as being totally unaffected by its contact with Greek culture. But largely I think you can look at this time period as one where lots of different traditional kind of pagan practices are being recontextualized and reimagined through the lens of Greco-Roman philosophy. So we have numerous examples of people who are writing about sacrifice and how does sacrifice work given the works of Plato or given the works of Aristotle. Cicero famously writes about the nature of the gods, and wants to try and harmonize the way that traditional Roman practices work in light of the discoveries that an author like Plato has made. So I think that you can make the argument that that's exactly what's going on with Julia Domna as well.
So what sorts of things is she getting into?
Well, Julia Domna, as far as we can tell, is sort of part of a neo-Pythagorean movement. Which
makes sense with Philostratus.
Yeah, exactly.
And we'll get into the text in a little bit too.
Sure, yeah. But so Julia Domna is just in the same way that this time period is a time of reinterest in the reading and understanding the philosophers. That is broadly true across many different schools of philosophy. I would say the real famous example is the movement towards Neoplatonism that is happening right around exactly this time as Julia Domna is taking a new interest in patronizing philosophers. So the difference being that Julia Domna is while she's certainly interested in Plato's works, and she's probably interested in Stoic philosophy as well, she seems to be very interested in Pythagorean philosophy, especially in the context of there's a tradition that Pythagoras really is the main inspiration for Socrates, and as a result for Plato as well. So a lot of people who are interested in Platonic philosophy are almost trying to look for a more pure form of Platonism, whatever that means. And there's such an interest in uncovering the pure teachings of Plato that they sort of go even back a step further and are aiming to study Pythagoras as a result, if he was the inspiration for Socrates and Plato in the first place.
Yeah, the older the better.
Yeah.
And these figures, somebody like Plato, somebody like Pythagoras, there's been so much time from when they were writing and practicing to what we're talking about now during the Severan period, that they almost have a quasi-mythical quality to them.
Definitely.
Philostratus speaks of Pythagoras as someone who could do extraordinary supernatural things and who was reincarnated. And there's all of these, I don't want to say magical, that word's a little bit loaded, but this supernatural element that comes into these philosophers. And I wonder if Apollonius is not similar to that, because Philostratus is writing about someone who lived in the past as well, not nearly as far back, but someone who's a follower of Pythagoras's tradition, and someone who likewise can do kind of these miraculous things just purely as a result of his study of this philosophical tradition.
Definitely. Yeah. So you have to sort of ask yourself, like, what is the point of studying, philosophy at all? And
big question.
It's a big question. But I mean, the philosophers themselves are trying to answer that question, and they point to a series of supposed advantages, and they range from achieving virtue, right? Developing your own personal arete, right? Your excellence, right? Or in the Stoic case, it's developing a sense of sophrosune, right? A sense of like a calm mind, right? It's a way to handle the problems that are normal to human life. How do you deal with tragedy? How do you deal with loss? How do you deal with all of the terrible things that eventually befall all of us? But there are also those authors who make more kind of fabulous claims, right, and more miraculous claims, and they're making claims to the effect that the ultimate goal of philosophy is for the soul to be able to escape the body. Mm-hmm. Claims like this. And honestly, they're not some of these claims that get made at various points in Roman history, and even in Greek history, I might argue, are not so dissimilar from the claims that get made in Buddhist practices. The idea that you're going to sort of study and contemplate to the point where you transcend the human condition as a result of your study, and you achieve like a new level of consciousness, something like a nirvana, right? Or so you become like a bodhisattva, something like that.
And certainly with the reincarnation element.
Definitely, right. Pythagorean philosophy is famous, and Pythagoras was famous for making the claim that the soul is imprisoned inside of the body, and that the soul is a separate substance that's totally different from the body, and the soul is constantly being refreshed and reborn and reincarnated again and again, and this is what leads Pythagoras to make these claims about vegetarianism, where he says that you don't want to end up eating the meat of a family member, let's say, who had passed away in generations before and now has been reincarnated as a cow or a sheep or something like that.
Yeah, because it's not limited to being reincarnated into human bodies.
Correct. Yeah. What's funny to me about Pythagoras's theories is that he claims that the soul can be reincarnated into all kinds of different animals, but not chickens. Right? So chickens don't have souls, right? But beans do. So you can't eat beans because that might be the soul of your grandfather, right? But you can't eat a chicken because a chicken has no soul.
There's so many points in the text where this gets brought up. Apollonius says, oh, there's this random lion that is walking around in the city, but actually that lion has been possessed by the soul of a king, or something like that, where there's like these human animal possessions. And he is very clear about his vegetarian lifestyle and his refusal to, say, wear animal products and things like that because of this reason, because of the reincarnation element. So that's a little bit about Pythagoras. When we get to the Neo-Pythagoreans, are they practicing the same kind of lifestyle as Apollonius? Are they eating vegetarian? Are they, trying to renounce the pleasures of the world. Say, Apollonius is celibate, Apollonius doesn't eat meat, Apollonius doesn't drink wine, for example. Are there people in the Severan period that are doing that?
Yeah. Actually, there's a famous kind of community of Neo-Pythagoreans who look a lot like they're living in a monastery. So they sort of gather together for like a mutual aid, and they're all living a very ascetic lifestyle according to strict Pythagorean principles. So they're all they devote themselves to contemplation and study, and they're kind of cloistered away from society. But just like today, I mean, there's some people have religious beliefs that sort of operate in the background, and it's not a major part of their life. Sometimes you can be culturally associated with any number of different religious practices, but it doesn't really affect you in the day-to-day existence. And then there are some people that are, ready to join the priesthood or ready to join whatever austere, sect of whatever religious practice you like. So we should probably be thinking about this like there's kind of all manner and stripe in between. So a figure like Julia Domna, obviously this kind of life of strict asceticism and seclusion from society would not be possible politically for somebody, just because her duties as empress would stop her from doing that. And furthermore, a figure like Julia Domna is also going to be interested in her own native Syrian religious practices. And I don't think it's unreasonable to suppose that Julia Domna would have been incorporating parts of Neo-Pythagorean philosophy into her relationship with El Agabal or Jupiter or any of the other Roman gods that she would have been expected to sacrifice to and to worship in her role as the empress, right? So she would have had a pretty eclectic, religious and philosophical kind of life, I think.
And El Agabal is a sun god, correct?
Yes. There's so just based on the etymology of the name El Agabal, the Semitic god El is known all the way back to ancient Israelite practices and ancient Canaanite religious practice. So, as far back as 1000 BCE, maybe even earlier than that. And El just, in many Semitic languages just means God. Yeah. So, and then Gabal or Jabal is cognate with the Arabic word for mountain, right? So this is the god of the mountain. And beyond that, we don't really have a whole lot of detailed kind of mythology or information about what exactly this cult or this religious practice would have looked like. We sort of have to read about Elagabalus, who's a later descendant of sort of the Domna clan. Who eventually becomes the Roman emperor and brings all of this weird, from the Roman perspective, weird Syrian religious practice into Rome, and especially this wants the Roman people to be interested in cultivating the worship of this solar deity.
Yeah, and even going so far as to take the name of this god.
Yes, yeah, which is correct. I mean, we use the Romanized or the Latinized name Elagabalus, but it really is. It's a reference to El Agabal.
Yeah, almost like an Egyptian pharaoh associating themselves with a living deity.
Sure.
Which, the Roman Empire has changed so much at this point, but they're still not quite ready for that. Elagabalus doesn't quite make it, but
no, he doesn't. He does not end well.
No, but he tries, as a number of other emperors before had tried testing the boundaries and seeing how far they can get to this kind of like living God thing. But that, I feel like that's a whole other separate topic.
Listen, if you want to have me back and you want to do it, I mean, like you want to talk about the ancient world? I mean, I'm your guy.
I know. And by the way, just so everyone knows, this is what we do like over dinner as well. Like this is just a normal day for us.
That's true.
Okay, so is there anything else in terms of the context that you think is important before we turn to some passages in the text?
Yeah, I mean, just to say that this is a very rich intellectual tradition that we're talking about. So when we're reading texts from this time period, you sort of have to have your classics hat on. And you have to assume that what you're reading is consciously referential to more ancient works, especially when you're reading anything relating to philosophy or philosophical practice. So none of this stuff exists. None of this should be considered to be kind of like innovative. It's innovative in the sense that it's a retelling and reimagining of earlier philosophical traditions, and in the retelling and in the mixing and the reimagining, new stuff comes out, and new interpretations of the philosophical tradition comes out. But I mean, down to the actual vocabulary of the individual words, all of them are very loaded and consciously referential to more ancient texts. So whenever you're reading an author like Philostratus is a great example, there's going to be insertions that specifically relate back to Plato, Aristotle, Pythagoras, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I mean, that's I would just caution any reader who's going to approach this stuff to try and think of the text in that way.
And that's kind of a perfect segue to getting into some of the passages in the text, because what I thought we could look at are some of the places where Philostratus presents what seemed to me, having lived through watching you write your dissertation and getting a little bit of it secondhand, that seemed to me to be very conscious decisions to put a scene or an event or a conversation in that models the style of how philosophy is delivered, and we can get into that a little bit, and then B, demonstrates some of the core principles that I think the texts are trying to get across. So we picked out 3 scenes to talk about, and the first one is in Book 5. So Apollonius is in North Africa, and he's visited by the future Emperor Vespasian. And Vespasian is going to make a bid for empire. He wants to overthrow the usurper of the usurper of the usurper, Vitellius, during the year of the 4 emperors in 68-69 CE. So after the death of Nero, there's a power struggle with a few people. Nothing like the crisis, but it's maybe a harbinger of what's to come. And Vespasian wants to put his name in and kind of throw himself into this conflict and maybe take over as the emperor. And in the context of the text, Vespasian is a friend of Apollonius, or he becomes a friend of Apollonius because of his lifestyle and because of his, we'll say, moral compass. And the reason he wants to become emperor, at least as it's written, is that he can't stand by while all of these virtueless assholes are making a mockery of what the office of emperor is supposed to be. So he comes to seek the advice of Apollonius, because Apollonius won't come out to see him. He's like, I'm busy, come to me. And he brings with him 2 court advisors, Dio Chrysostom and Euphrates, who I thought was a fictional person, but may be a real person. I think I got to do some more research on that. But we know Dio Chrysostom is a real person.
Yes.
So who is he? Maybe we'll stop there.
So Dio Chrysostom is there's a Byzantine tradition. So there's a much later tradition that places Dio Chrysostom as a relative, a kind of distant relative that's maybe 2 generations older than Dio Cassius, right? Who I wrote my dissertation about. So Dio Chrysostom is a famous author who writes a series of orations about kingship addressed to Trajan, and Trajan, as this kind of sole ruler, presides over the greatest territorial extent of the Roman Empire. And oftentimes, if you see a map of the Roman Empire at its greatest extent, you're looking at a map of the Roman Empire during the sort of the end of Trajan's reign. Dio Chrysostom's kingship orations are famous because they give specific advice to the emperor, and they're part of a kind of literary genre almost, or subgenre, which is known as it's the speculum principis, right? It's a way for a trusted advisor who oftentimes is a court philosopher to sort of hold up in a mirror to the king or to the emperor. And this tradition goes all the way back to Hellenistic times. So if you imagine those successor kings to Alexander the Great, they used to compete with each other for legitimacy and to see who was the most powerful. But they would also sort of compete in this very soft power kind of way. The Ptolemies famously are collecting philosophers and scholars and artists and poets and putting them on the imperial payroll. And that becomes a mark of who the best king and who the best emperor is that if you have the best entourage of scholars and so forth, then that makes you an inherently better kind of king and a more powerful king.
Mm-hmm. And philosophers agree with that.
Philosophers definitely agree with that. Philosophers, love to give advice because going back to Plato, Plato writes the Republic.
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion about what a society should look like, how a society should set itself up, but then in particular how the leader or leaders of that society should behave.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what we get into in this passage here. So Vespasian brings Dio Chrysostom and the mythical Euphrates, who may be real, to have a debate with Apollonius kind of on this topic of leadership. And it's not quite so much how an emperor should behave. We do get into that after the conversation is over, but it's kind of a three-way debate about how Vespasian should set up his administration in a very practical sense. So, for example, Euphrates is the first to speak, and he argues that Vespasian should give his power back to the people immediately and restore what you could call some kind of democracy, or maybe it's just the Roman Republic, essentially to abolish the emperors altogether. And Dio Chrysostom supports that kind of, but he is okay with the idea of having an emperor. And then Apollonius comes in and says, well, having an emperor is inevitable. But what strikes me about this conversation, and I can only say this because, again, I watched you write your dissertation in this very spot, they're basically trying to decide what kind of structure the society should have. So I guess I just want to get your initial impressions of this scene. Is there anything you can tell us about what this scene is supposed to represent or the tradition that it falls under?
Yeah, absolutely. So Cassius Dio is contemporary to this, and he writes a very similar quote unquote constitutional debate. Debating about constitutions is baked into Greek philosophy, again, going back to the time of Plato. So to really understand what's going on in any of these constitutional debates, you have to understand what the ancient conception of constitutions were, right? So Plato sort of conceives of the different constitutions on a sliding scale from best to worst, right? So the best constitution is a monarchy or an aristocracy, something like that. And in Plato's mind, anyway, the constitutions naturally degrade from best to worst. So they go through a kind of a series of changes. So monarchy is the beginning, and this degrades into an aristocracy, which degrades into a timocracy. The government is ruled by people who are competing with each other for honors, right?
Okay.
Is a timocracy. And then this kind of, worse than that is an oligarchy. And then underneath an oligarchy is a democracy. And then worse, the very worst is tyranny. So in the ancient mind, democracy and tyranny are very closely associated together. And this is why democracy, for the most part, gets a very bad reputation.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Because tyranny and monarchy, in terms of the structure, would be similar, right? One person at the top?
Very much so, yeah. So
what's the distinction then between a monarchy and a tyranny?
So if we were to get Sean Lewis here, there's many authors who write about this distinction, and the consensus among scholars right now is that the distinction is kind of a semantic distinction, that a tyranny is a mirror image bizarro monarchy. So what makes a monarchy good is when the monarch himself is good, right? And Plato would be advocating for the figure of like the philosopher king, right?
Yeah.
And that's the absolute, because the monarchy is the best type of constitution. You need to have the best type of monarch, right? And when that monarch rules with philosophical kind of perfection, the monarch is asking questions. He's a trained philosopher. He's pursuing virtue. He's doing all these other kinds of things. Then the monarchy is very, very good, right? And a tyranny, on the contrary, it's the same kind of structure, but the monarch, instead of pursuing virtue, is corrupted by vice. And through that corruption, the monarch ends up just destroying the society, because the vices, as they corrupt him, the monarch will then corrupt everything around him, and the vice will kind of spread like a disease or like a cancer, right, throughout the society from the top down, right?
So he's supposed to lead by example.
Yes,
and
definitely.
the example that he's supposed to lead by, or the type of person that he is supposed to be, is modeled after these philosophical ideas of what is virtuous, what is right action, what is a good way to live.
Yes, definitely.
It's interesting. I want to find this quote. Hold on. So there's one point in this debate when Apollonius is speaking, and of course, because this is the biography of Apollonius of Tyana, who is the best of everything, you get two people who speak before him, and then he just comes in, owns everyone with facts and logic, blows everybody out of the water, and he's arguing for monarchy, which it sounds like is your idea, or not your idea, but what you're talking about with the philosopher king.
I didn't write any of this.
No, but this idea that monarchy is good, provided that the monarch is good. And he seems to think that Vespasian is good because he's seeking out this constitutional debate. He has philosophers around him, and he's really trying to be virtuous. But I just want to read this part to you. So Apollonius says, "For myself, I care little about constitutions, seeing that my life is governed by the gods. But I do not like to see the human flock perish for want of a shepherd, at once just and moderate. For just as a single man preeminent in virtue transforms a democracy into the guise of a government of a single man who is the best, so the government of one man, if it provides all round for the welfare of the community, is popular government." So this is kind of like what you're saying. The monarch who should be good, his behavior, his lifestyle will trickle down to the people and make the people better all around. Is that kind of what the philosopher king is supposed to be?
Definitely. The philosopher king, through the pursuit of virtue, is supposed to assimilate himself towards the divine, right? Whatever that means, right? So towards the realm of the ideas, the realm of the forms, right?
The transcendent.
Right, the transcendent. And as a result of doing that, because Plato kind of tends to view the world in like almost like a fractal kind of way, where there's like a pattern and it's just repeated at every level of magnification one wants to. So if you zoom out to the most macro view, and you zoom into the most micro view, you'll find the same kind of structure, right? So the idea is that as the philosopher king is assimilating himself to the divine and the transcendent, so his subjects are assimilating themselves to the philosopher king, right? And in that way, everybody is rising towards virtue in a way that they can't even help or maybe not even notice, right? Now, what's interesting to me about the citation that you just gave, or the quote you just gave, is that this is kind of a popular opinion at the time, that the government of the Roman people is, in a sense, the best possible government that anybody could ever come up with, because it's a mixture of the three pure forms of government, right? Which is a monarchy, an oligarchy, and a democracy. So because the Roman government is mixed in this kind of way, and this is according to Polybius, who is writing, again, much earlier, and he's writing about the Roman constitution, and sort of compares the Roman constitution to the Spartan constitution, which was similarly made, right? The monarchical part of the Roman constitution in Republican times was represented by the consuls, right? And there's two of them. The oligarchic part is represented by the Senate, right? And the democratic part is represented by the popular assemblies, and those kind of offices that were elected by popular vote. So for many philosophers living in imperial times, they're sort of viewing the Roman Empire as being improved, right, by the position of the emperor. Because now, rather than having two consuls representing the monarchic part of the empire, you just have one monarch representing the monarchic part of the empire. And that, but the essential mixture underneath survives the transition from republic to empire. And there's a lot of literature out there, a lot of scholarship out there that sort of equates popular sovereignty and democracy with good government, with the role of like a quote unquote good emperor. And this is actually a kind of a state of affairs that survives the Roman Empire and continues on into like the medieval Roman context or the Byzantine context. If you wanted to read Anthony Caldelis, he makes this a similar kind of argument for that context as well, a much later context than what we're talking about.
Yeah, so this kind of debate, this constitutional debate, is like a set piece in philosophical texts. And it's old, right? It begins in Herodotus or...
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
So this is what Philostratus is doing then is he's putting this in here as like as a nod to this tradition that you've been referencing, this continuation of thought, of political thought from, we'll say, classical Greece up to now.
And beyond.
And beyond.
Yeah, I would argue, yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. So after they finish this debate and Apollonius owns everyone with facts and logic, and obviously Vespasian follows his advice, he asks Apollonius to tell him what kind of a monarch he should be. And you mentioned this already too, these qualities that a monarch is supposed to have, how the philosopher king is set up. So these are all coming from the Platonic tradition, or from, I guess, the broader tradition of political philosophy, right?
Yeah, these are the cardinal virtues, right? So it's temperance, it's justice, it's manliness, it's wisdom, right? There's several that are pursued, and actually these cardinal virtues survive classical antiquity and sort of get adopted in the Christian tradition. So there's the cardinal virtues, the same Platonic cardinal virtues still exist in Catholicism today. So any emperor or any king who is going to pursue those virtues is immediately a better and more qualified candidate for the throne. And the way that a lot of these authors from this time period describe emperors is based on whether or not they have achieved or are pursuing these virtues. And for those emperors who are good, quote unquote, they have all the virtues, right? For those emperors that are bad, they never get described with, sort of in pursuit of these same types of virtues, right?
So then the list of things that Apollonius tells Vespasian, he's not inventing this out of nowhere.
No.
These are the same ideas, tremble before the absoluteness of your prerogative, for so you will exercise it with the greatest moderation.
Yeah, moderation is that's a big one. That's an essential virtue, and not just moderation, but everything that comes from moderation, including things like temperance and mercy and things like that. But I'm sorry, keep going.
Yeah, no, so I'm just sort of picking through here. Yeah, don't worry too much about money is one. Use money as a tool, but don't, go crazy.
That's because the pursuit of money is a known pathway to tyranny. And it's Plato describes that in detail in Book 9 of the Republic. He talks all about how that sets the bad monarch or the tyrant on the primrose path, that they just consume lots and lots of money, and they have like an insatiable need for more.
In a way, it's not moderation.
Yes, right. The inverse or the mirror image, right? The negative, right, of moderation.
Yeah, because he's not telling Vespasian, obviously it would not be possible for Vespasian to renounce worldly things and live as a mendicant, live as an ascetic, kind of wandering philosopher priest, if you will, while also being the emperor. He has to engage in the world, but he has to do so in a way that is not over the top. Right.
Yeah, a way that is moderated through his philosophical training and his like intellectual abilities and exercise and so forth, right? I mean, again, this all comes from books 5 and 6 of Plato's Republic, where Plato talks at length about the way that you're supposed to be trained to be able to take on the responsibility of ruling the ideal republic, and again, according to Plato's logic. Because there's an ideal version out there, right? That ideal version exists in the world of the forms, and the closer that we are to that ideal, the better the result is. So the more that you can act like the philosopher king from books 5 and 6 of the Republic, right? The better the result necessarily will be in reality.
Let's do another one then. Sure. He talks about dealing with revolution or dealing with dissatisfaction in the people, and he says that the way to control something like that is not to go in full force and just wipe out all of the dissenters, we'll say, but to slowly over time appease the dissatisfaction of the people. Is this another thing that we see coming up?
Yeah, definitely. There's a classic fault, a classic vice of the tyrant is to use your power like a blunt instrument. So to be bloodthirsty, right, is the way that Plato conceives of it. Is he actually likens the tyrant to a werewolf. Right. And he says that once the werewolf has tasted human blood, he sort of becomes addicted to it. And this is actually probably a reference to what actually happened in Plato's life, because Plato lived through a period of great political instability at the end of the Peloponnesian War. So he lived under the tyranny of the so-called 40 tyrants. And he lived through a period of like a military junta that was out of control, where people were, sort of unjustly and summarily executed, and their property was robbed, and things like that. And indeed, when you look at any other period of great political instability, it doesn't even necessarily have to be a time of political instability. I mean, a lot of people look at the reigns of Domitian, where Domitian is a quasi tyrant because he's conducting treason trials. He's conducting, he's using his power like a blunt instrument, and he's actually sowing more dissatisfaction among the people by treating the people in this kind of high-handed, harsh type manner, and that makes perfect sense. Why we would see the recommendation to do the opposite, right? To use some finesse. Right?
Yeah. And maybe now is a good time to turn to Domitian, because he is kind of the main villain of our story here, the representative of tyranny, at least opposed to Apollonius. But before we move on really quickly, that idea of the werewolf has me thinking, because in book, I don't know if it's 4 or 5, I think it's book 4 of The Life of Apollonius, Nero is compared to a wild animal.
Yeah.
So it's all kind of in there.
Yeah.
But yeah, let's turn to Domitian now, because the next section that I wanted to get your opinion on is the beginning of book 7, when we really start to get into the problem of Domitian. And at the beginning of book 7, we hear that Domitian has taken steps against philosophy in the empire. He's outlawing the practice of philosophy. He is arresting philosophers. People are running away from the city. And Apollonius comes under fire because he's going around trashing Domitian, as he is wont to do, to speak out against this kind of malarkey that Domitian is getting up to. And he gets ratted out, and so he comes onto Domitian's radar. And at the beginning of book 7, we see him and his best buddy Damis coming towards the city of Rome, making a stop with their friend Demetrius, who is living at Cicero's old house, of course. And they are asking themselves what Apollonius should do about this problem of Domitian, and about the fact that he is, there's a warrant out for his arrest, and they're trying to implicate him in a plot with Nerva, and see, he's in trouble, and it's like, what should he do? Because he is so magical and special that he could just run away and be totally fine. But is that the right thing to do? So as we get into this conversation that Apollonius and Damis and Demetrius have, we begin book 7 with a catalog of philosophers who stood up to tyranny. The opening line of the book is, "I am aware that the conduct of philosophers under despotism is the truest touchstone of their character." And this seems to be the main thesis of the book, because we get the rest of the story from book 7 and book 8 that are devoted to this question. How should a philosopher conduct themselves when the philosopher king is not present? When the form of government has degraded into the worst form of government that there is. So we have just kind of a list of guys here, and notably, I will not say that Plato somewhat lacked wisdom when he set himself to reform the affairs of Sicily rather than those of Athens, or that he was sold in all fairness when, after deceiving others, he found himself deceived, for I fear to offend my readers.
Yeah. Yeah. Hilarious, right? He's, so, I mean, this whole section of the life of Apollonius is sort of written very, very self-consciously in the style of a textbook type of training exercise that was used for young rhetors, right? So you have to imagine that people alive at the time on their journey to become a philosopher sort of pass through this and again, there's lots of debate about this, but there's almost like an intermediary stage that you pass through where you go from being a rhetor to being a true philosopher as a result. But they're definitely connected, and they're sort of on the same type of spectrum. So as a young man, learning this added Greek idiom, one of the things that you'd be expected to do would be you'd be training under a rhetor, right? A orator is a professional instructor of rhetoric, and the orator would be trying to do things like give his students a question, like much like the one you just asked, right? What should one do when the philosophical life or the good life is out of reach, right? It's no longer on the table, as it were. It's something unavailable, right? How do you still live the good life, right? And then those students would be expected to do something like write a dialogue in the Attic style between two different interlocutors or three different interlocutors, and have this type of debate. And they would be graded for their command of Attic grammar and vocabulary and so on and so forth. So that's sort of what this speech is, right? It's a way of exploring in a socially acceptable and rhetorically acceptable way, a way of producing new philosophical debate in the style of Plato, right? And this is why he says, I'm not going to say all of this bad stuff about Plato because it's going to offend my audience.
Yeah.
And it would be offensive to the audience.
Yeah.
And this is also a famous rhetorical trick where you don't want to say something bad. So you start by saying something like, well, I'm not going to say, right? And then it goes on, and then you trash whoever the.
Yeah. And his motivation in trashing Plato and trashing all these other guys is really just to say that they all did really interesting and important things, not as interesting, not as important as Apollonius, because Apollonius is the best. So a student of philosophy, someone who is aspiring to be a philosopher, would be answering questions in a formal way. And I would imagine that as they go through their training, the questions get harder and harder and harder, right?
Sure.
So the reason I say that is because as we progress from book 1 up to this point where this debate with Apollonius and Damis and Demetrius, we see Apollonius and Damis talking to each other in a philosophical way, answering questions about things, but the questions get harder and harder. Yeah. And even the questions that Apollonius answers, when he's visiting Phraotes in book 3, they're just talking about how much wine affects sleep. It's kind of a low stakes question, but this is a very high stakes question, both in a rhetorical, maybe not rhetorical sense, but in a kind of abstract sense. What does the ideal philosopher do under the absolute picture of tyranny? But then it has very real consequences as well, because Apollonius then has to act after this conversation. Right.
And I want to sort of add for a second here that the setting that this is set in, where they sit under a plane tree. It's a direct reference to the Phaedrus, right? To another one of Plato's very famous works. So that's sort of where philosophy, like high level philosophy, happens. Is it happens in a dialogue underneath a plane tree because of the Phaedrus forever after, right? So there's many other examples where you can point to from second sophistic literature that happened just like this, right? So you're tackling a very, very heavy question, and it has to be in like the exact Socratic type environment. So it almost feels like they want to put it in the same type of environment so that it will like the through some kind of transitive property, right? They will come up with like a better answer, right? If they recreate the exact type of environment that Plato and Socrates or that Plato records that presumably Socrates did, right? So I would say that the answer to this for the most part in debates like this, it comes back to a pursuit of virtue. No matter what the stakes, and that the virtuous path, right, and following those cardinal virtues must be the answer, even when it results in the death of the philosopher. So this is sort of what happens in the Apology, where Socrates, is arrested for atheism, right? For introducing all of these new kind of religious innovations that are very, very counter to traditional, Greek indigenous, paganism. And as a result of having this kind of corruption of the youth and talking about all of these new ways to understand Greek religion, the state now decides that we have to kill Socrates, right? As a result, and Socrates very famously accepts his fate with Sophrosune, right? With eudaimonia, right? And gracefully says, well, if this is the way that it's got to go, I'm never going to deviate from the path of virtue. I'm never going to recant. I didn't do anything wrong. The state is wrong. This is not justice. And you'll see later. You'll figure it out after I'm gone. It's that sort of attitude. And from what I gather from this same type of scene of Apollonius, the same thing is true. Right?
Yeah, he's never going to waver. And we're set up for this idea that the state does not, the law does not equal justice.
Correct.
We get a whole debate about this with the Gymnosophists in Book 6, where they use Socrates as an example, actually, to say that, just because there is a law, it doesn't mean that law is the form, the ideal of justice. And so it's not a clear way to be just. To follow the law is not a clear path to justice. And there are times when justice and the law don't align with one another. And then as soon as that book is over, we immediately get an example of this with Apollonius being put on trial. And, Demetrius in particular spends a lot of time talking about the laws as they currently are. He says wisdom has been rendered a penal offense. He says that the philosopher is criminalized under this new regime, and that virtue and justice are not welcome in the law. So anytime that you're being put on trial in this system, it's not going to be a fair trial. And, because Apollonius begins the conversation, right, by saying to Demetrius, well, would you run away if you were in my position? And Demetrius says, I wouldn't run away if I was facing a fair trial, but you're not facing a fair trial. So it's kind of a pointless, fruitless exercise for you to just go to your death to gain nothing, because you're not going to get a chance to defend yourself and defend philosophy. But of course he does, right? He does get a chance to defend himself and defend philosophy at the start of Book 8. But I don't know if we're ready to move on quite to there. Is there anything else that you want to say about this conversation?
Yeah. This is such a fundamental part of Platonic tradition, of the Platonic tradition and Plato's philosophy. It's how the Republic opens, is in search for a definition for what justice is. So whenever we start having these types of explorations of the concept of justice, you can be sure that really everybody who is literate at the time of the writing of this document is really doing a lot of heavy duty engagement with Platonic philosophy and Aristotelian philosophy and Stoic philosophy afterwards, because Plato being the first sets the stage for the other schools of philosophy sort of that come after. And because Plato is interested in the definition of justice, therefore so are the Stoics, and so is Aristotle, and so are all these other people. So you almost can't be a real philosopher unless you tackle this subject of what justice is, and you have to tackle it in a way that is interesting and in a way that pays respect to the greater, more ancient tradition, and then theoretically you're going to have some sort of novel spin on what the answer is, but not too novel. Right. So, I mean, it's another thing, you're talking about a very, very deeply conservative society, conservative in the sense that they are trying to preserve ancient wisdom or conserve ancient wisdom. So innovation is generally speaking not welcome in these types of conversations, a little bit of innovation is okay if you cloak it in sort of the wrappings of a very, very traditional definition, right? According to Plato or Speusippus or, whoever else, right? Yeah. Pick your scholarch, right? They will have come up with some sort of innovation, albeit a 700 or 800-year-old one, right? By the time of the writing of the life of Apollonius. So, yeah.
Yeah, so what does Platonic justice look like?
Plato doesn't ever really come up with a good answer, right? He never defines justice, but he sort of defines around justice, right? So the argument starts with the interlocutors saying that justice is returning to everybody what their just desert is, right? Giving everybody what they deserve. And Socrates in Book 1 of the Republic is able to shoot this down immediately by coming up with a thought experiment, saying that if I had a need of weapons and I borrowed these weapons from a friend of mine, and my friend subsequently loses his mind, goes insane, and he asks for the weapons back, is that just, right, to give him the weapons back? Knowing that in his, state of mental unwellness, he might hurt himself or others, right? And and then, well, clearly that doesn't seem like a good definition of justice, right?
Yeah.
There's another contra example, right? We learn a lot about like what justice is not, right? Almost more than what we learn what justice is. Right. So, the idea, in the broad sweep of the philosophical tradition at this point is that justice is a quasi-divine, idea or form, right, that exists in the world of the forms, and that actually practicing perfect justice might be impossible. In the intelligible or in the physical realm, rather, right? Yeah. So this is something that you can never really perfectly achieve, but you're striving to achieve it at all times, right? So maybe that's the best way to think about how they were thinking about justice at the time, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And Domitian isn't doing any of that.
Domitian doesn't do any of that. No. Domitian is not interested. No.
He does not care about justice at all. Mm-mm. He is a pure Platonic tyrant. Yeah. And Apollonius faces off with him. So the last passage that we were going to talk about is Apollonius's defense speech, his apologia, which I think maybe even more than the debates is well known for being a set piece in philosophy, just purely because of Socrates' apology, usually called Plato's apology, but it's a defense speech by Socrates, which is not an apology in the modern English sense of the word, but is an apologia, a defense speech in a law court.
Yeah, you're speaking away the charges, right? You're trying to turn away the accusation, right, against you, right? So this is, I mean, literally what it means, right? Is apo is a way, and the logos is like a word or conversation, or the logia is a conversation, right? So that's what an apology is, right? In this context, it's a defense speech.
And Philostratus has his cake and eats it too with this scene, because he gives us a very brief account of the trial where Domitian brings one charge and Apollonius gives like a 1 or 2 sentence defense against that charge, and then Domitian is very impressed, everybody claps, and then Apollonius throws a smoke bomb and leaves. But then we get immediately after that like 30 pages of this apologia, which to me reads as both showing off the style of the writing, really deep diving into how to give an argument, and then also the things that come up in this speech, in particular, the direct defense of philosophy. I think that's part of why it's in here in the form that it's in. This is where Apollonius says philosophy is the only art that people come to for its own sake. It has the express goal of making people's lives better. It is not the pursuit of money, and he makes the distinction there. He uses Euphrates as the example, maybe as we were talking about earlier, between the philosopher and the charlatan, or the sophist, which is, it's kind of a loaded word because you have the second sophistic, but in this case, sophist is a pejorative, and it means a fake philosopher, a philosopher who's just in it to get personal gain, but who isn't saying anything interesting or important. And Apollonius goes through and explains how, there's no way that Nerva could have paid me to help him in a revolution because I don't really care about money, and so on and so forth. Well, let me start with your takeaways from this speech. What do you get out of this?
Yeah, I really like how there's a weird kind of tension going on between how temporal, right, should the how much should philosophy affect reality and affect the government, right? And the answer for most philosophers in this tradition of philosophy is quite a bit, right? And this does provide a huge amount of tension between those temporal leaders, right, and those for lack of a better term, right, spiritual leaders. Because if you think about it, just from a practical perspective, when you're dealing with a sole Roman emperor or a sole Roman authority, outside of this paradigm of, what Plato believes the philosopher king should be up to, right? We also have the example of, real governments, right? And real monarchies that can be undone by allowing sort of alternative power centers to develop inside of that imperial structure. So there's many different historians of the Roman Empire that sort of point to how independent military commanders who nominally are supportive of the Roman project. So people like Septimius Severus, right, is a military commander who has his own independent source of military power. And when there's a collapse in central authority, these independent sources of power and authority can rise up and become a threat to the central government. And that's sort of what happens during the year of the four emperors. And you can argue it happens again during the year of the five emperors, which is how Septimius Severus rises to power, and then happens continuously throughout the crisis of the 3rd century. But even if we don't pick a military power, we can pick a spiritual power, right? And this is part of what Augustus's sort of plan for centralizing all of these independent sources of power that existed previously in Republican Rome into the hands of what will become the emperor, right? So Augustus, is famous for concentrating the powers that the chief priest, the Pontifex Maximus of the Roman state religion would normally wield. He takes those powers away from the Pontifex Maximus, including the title Pontifex Maximus, and folds them into the office of emperor, specifically so that he won't have a challenge, right, to the emperor's power in this way, right? So, despite what Plato might be advocating for, which is to give all of these kinds of powers and authorities to the philosopher king, and let the philosopher king wisely rule over everything, it is in fact impossible to practically perform the job of emperor over a multinational empire like the Roman Empire, forgive me, without empowering people around you, right? And because you must empower people around you, and because there are going to be individual locuses of power, spiritual, military, philosophical, political, et cetera, we're really dealing with a complex question that in a lot of ways, ancient people are not really equipped to answer, because the nature of their answers are sort of based on this 800-year-old, 700-year-old philosophy, and they're not really allowed, or at least they don't feel like they're allowed to innovate in this way. We talked about this before. So I think what we're reading with this particular apology is it's meant as an exploration, right? Can we do better than we have done in the past? Can we come to any more answers within these confines that we've sort of, that we must deal with culturally? Can we reach back into the annals of history and the annals of intellectual history and philosophy, and can we try and reinterpret or re-examine or reconfigure the way that these philosophers conceived of good government, and can we pull out an answer for our own times? Is sort of the way that I look at it. Unfortunately for the Romans, the answer to that question seems to be no, right?
Yeah.
Given what actually does happen in the decades after Philostratus has written this.
Right.
So Philostratus is writing all of this at a safe distance. This is all. This should be understood that because Philostratus is living in the context of an absolute monarchy, one that is not necessarily friendly to philosophy. Despite the example of Julia Domna, Septimius Severus, there's no indication that Septimius Severus is interested in this type of intellectual pursuit in the way that his wife is. And certainly his sons, Caracalla and Geta, are definitely not interested in any of this. So Philostratus writing sort of at the time of Caracalla and Geta probably sees himself very much in the position of Apollonius. Mm-hmm. What am I supposed to do?
Yeah.
And how should I continue pursuing this position of authority, albeit philosophical or spiritual? And if I do that, is it going to cost me my life? Mm-hmm. Because the example of parousia, right, of freedom of speech, it's famously curtailed, under the imperial system, and we have lots and lots of literature exploring that, right? How freely am I allowed to speak, right? And you can see the answer is not very, because we have to retroject this debate 100 years previous. Mm-hmm. Or maybe not 100, but close to it, right? To feel safe, right? So
and to put it in the mouth of someone who stands outside of society, as Apollonius does, but even he is facing directly up against the so-called justice system under Domitian, and he is on trial. In part because they're trying to get him wrapped up in this whole Nerva thing to try and get Nerva, but in part because he was giving speeches at Ephesus, and they didn't like what he was saying.
Sure.
But one thing that I find really, really interesting about this speech in particular is because we hear so much about how bad Domitian is in the lead up to this speech, and we see Apollonius kind of get digs in on Domitian. Domitian says, "Oh, look, you're a daimon." And Apollonius is like, "I thought you worshipped Athena, goddess of wisdom. Clearly she's not good for you if you are confusing men with daimons." He's like throwing digs at Domitian. But then in this speech, I think naturally he's very polite towards Domitian, but he also, at the start of the speech and at the end of the speech, he extends an invitation to Domitian. He says, "Philosophy is a great way of life, and you can too." Despite the fact that Domitian is characterized so clearly as a tyrant in this text, there is still room even for the tyrant to come back and to adopt a philosophical way of life to the betterment of himself and by extension, as you were talking about, to his subjects. So there is a kind of goodwill that we get towards Domitian and towards the figure of the tyrant. And I wonder if that is also Philostratus's way. I think it's sincere, but I also think it might be Philostratus's way of saying, look, I'm not trying to, say anything about anything. I'm not trying to get in trouble. I'm just saying that you can have all of the wonderful things that philosophy brings, and it will make you a better ruler for it.
Yeah. No, I mean, it also readily explains why we have that reference in the beginning to the relationship between Plato and Dion of Sicily. There's the famous story in the 7th letter of Plato is that Plato is going to go and prove that philosophy is the cure for bad government, and he's going to go and convince the tyrant of Sicily, Dion, that he just needs to adopt this philosophical type of lifestyle, and that once he does and becomes a student of philosophy, he won't be a tyrant anymore. It'll fix the bad government of the city. It'll do all this other kind of stuff, and then it didn't work, right? So but it is a famous example because there was a belief, a general belief that everybody can improve if only they were to take these lessons of philosophy to heart. As a general piece of advice, I don't think it's a bad piece of advice, right? Nobody ever seems to suffer from a more rational, more level-headed, more virtuous way of life, right? You don't. I mean, I'm talking about modern day.
Yeah.
You generally speaking, the advice that you give to somebody who's struggling is not, well, why don't you become an alcoholic on top of that, right?
Right. Right.
So on the one hand, right, it is, great advice, and it is, it seems like it's going to work, but on the other hand, it doesn't work all the time, right?
No, it's up to Domitian to decide whether or not he wants to take that advice. And of course, we know, and Philostratus knows because he's also looking at this from the future, we know that Domitian does not. And we know that Domitian is assassinated, which comes pretty shortly after this discussion in the text. And I said this in the last video as I was covering this section of the biography itself, but the death of Domitian comes as almost like an afterthought. It's like, oh, well, he didn't take the advice and he got killed anyway. It's kind of just like nothing good came of it, but Apollonius does try in this moment. Yeah.
Which I mean, ultimately, I mean, it's sort of, it's all you can do, isn't it? Right? All you can do is encourage people to listen to good advice, be a better person, do better.
And it's universal advice because he gives the same advice not only to Domitian, not only to all of the other leaders that he meets throughout his life and travels, but to I guess in the context of the story, in the Roman mindset, someone who is lowly, somebody like Damis, who is a provincial. He is a young guy, maybe even a teenager, as he meets Apollonius. He offers himself as a scribe or as like an assistant or a translator. He doesn't know anything about anything because he comes from a place that is not touched by these intellectual traditions. And yet philosophy is open to him, and by the end of the text, he does come into his own as a full philosopher. And after the death of Domitian, he gets appointed to be an advisor to Nerva. Yeah, so Damis kind of becomes his own philosopher in a way. It is a universal kind of approach, or anyone can have these benefits. Is there anything else about this speech that you wanted to bring up?
I think that the takeaway of it is that This type of apologia is going to continue all the way up until the time of Anna Komnene,
and much later,
much later. So really, we should be thinking like an additional 700 years after this period.
Yep.
And there's other Western authors and Christian authors who are going to be reading this type of dialogue and this type of speech. And they still find it to be useful, and they're still conceiving of this type of debate, in this very same kind of framework. The way that it'll change is that it sort of goes away from whether or not the philosopher should be understood as this kind of like rival to temporal power. But sort of becomes a question of what is going to be the role of the church, and what kind of power should it wield in the future. And we have many examples from sort of medieval Italian authors who are asking essentially the same question, but with sort of the players using different names, right, for their relative positions. It should not really be understood as a settled problem, right? At the end of this speech, the problem it continues, right? And there's going to be lots more authors are going to try and chime in very much the same terms in the future.
Absolutely fascinating. Last question.
Sure.
For no reason in particular at all. What do you think? How should someone who aspires to the philosophical lifestyle act when that temporal power, when the government goes sideways, when we're faced with a tyrannical government? How should someone who wants to live as a philosopher does, or someone who is pursuing virtue, what should they do?
That's a great question. I am utterly unqualified to answer that. I don't know. I'm not a spiritual leader. I'm not giving advice in this kind of way. I'm not telling anybody how to live because I don't know how to do it. So the question has been asked again, recently in the context of if you're a religious figure in a regime like Soviet Russia or communist Cuba, what do you do? What is your relationship going to be, to the state, especially when the state has specifically made your flavor of religious practice illegal?
Christian martyrdom, actually, the history, the tradition of Christian martyrdom.
Yeah, I think that essentially it's the same question being asked, just in a different context. And I can tell myself personally as a coward. My answer is that I'm gonna be Damus Euphrates over here. I'm gonna run. I'm gonna stop talking to anybody. I'm gonna save my own skin and hope that everything blows over and gets better. I'm not pursuing virtue in this way. I don't think it's I don't know that any of the things that I have pursued can be understood as virtuous. I mean, maybe studying is virtuous, maybe learning a lot of stuff is virtuous, but I don't do that. I do that for totally selfish reasons. I do it because I like it and because I want to. I am not trying to ascend to the realm of the forms. I don't think that I'm not really concerned about the quality of my soul. I don't believe that the vices that I'm experiencing in life are leaving physical marks on the soul in that way. I don't think any of that is correct. But that doesn't mean I can't be interested in it and learn about it. And I am interested in it, and I think I have learned a lot about it. And I would like to hide from people who want to stop me or do it secretly in a deeply subversive kind of way. And then save my notes and then have somebody, put it on the internet after the fact or change my name and then publish under a pseudonym or something like that. That's probably what I would do, right? I would try to have my cake and eat it too. in a Weasley, slippery kind of, in a way like that. Yeah.
Well, it is a question that a lot of people are thinking about these days. And so it's up to everyone to kind of decide how they're going to proceed if, perchance, this type of tyrannical situation were to come up. So everyone kind of has to answer that question for themselves. So I guess that's where we'll leave it. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me. Like I said before, I mean, what am I doing? Put a microphone in front of me, ask me questions about the ancient world. I would love to. I would love to do it again. I'll come back whenever you want.
Yeah, well, we'll definitely sit down again. There's so many things that we can talk about. But in the meantime, I guess we will leave it there. So thanks everyone for tuning in. I do want to bring up, someone is doing an online conference on this question. Philosophy versus tyranny. What should philosophers do in the face of tyranny? It's run by the Plato's Academy Center. It's going to take place at the end of July. I don't know any of these people. I don't know if you know any of these people. I'm not obviously associated with them or affiliated with them, but it sounds like a really interesting, it's a free online virtual conference. It's happening at the end of July. So I'm going to put a link to where you can sign up for it. I know I will be tuning in. I think you'll be tuning in with me.
Sure.
And so maybe this question will get, we'll get some different perspectives. We'll get some new ideas of how one might face a tyrant, again, for no particular reason at all.
Sure.
All right. So that's all I wanted to say. Thanks, everyone, for watching and tuning in. I'll be back in a couple of weeks, and we'll have you back to talk about more things in the future. So thanks so much.
Thank you.